This is CUNY TV, the City University of New York.
Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. On October 20th, 1981, a band of militant zealots armed with automatic weapons tried to rob a Brinks truck in a shopping mall in Nanuet in Rockland County, New York. Before it was over, 2 armored car guards were shot and 2 police officers, one black and one white, were gunned down at a roadblock. The crime was one of the last spasms of 60s-style left-wing violence. Judith Clark was one of 4 people arrested that day for armed robbery and murder. She was tried and sentenced to 75 years and was sent to the maximum security prison for women at Bedford Hills in Westchester County to begin the rest of her life. 30 years later, Judith Clark is still at Bedford Hills and is the subject of the January 15, 2012 New York Times Magazine cover story. The article, Radical Transformation, has led to a renewed conversation about justice, crime and punishment, and rehabilitation and revenge. It has opened up old wounds and to others offered new hope. Joining me is its author, Tom Robbins, reporter extraordinaire, a civic treasure, formerly of the New York Daily News and the Village Voice. He now heads the Investigative Reporting program at the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism. I'm proud to say we are colleagues there. Today we'll talk about Judith Clark and the impact of the article, and then turn to more current matters of crime, justice, and policing. Welcome back, Tom.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, let's start with the title. Your title, editor's title, great title.
It is a great title, and it wasn't mine. It was something which I think really captured exactly what Judith Clark had done, but also offered readers a chance to wonder, well, is this for real? Okay,
and to a certain extent, as the great writer that you are, you sort of lead us to the water almost, but you're not forcing us to drink. We'll talk about that shortly. Has she been transformed? And what is the nature of this transformation?
I believe that Judy Clark is a different person from the person who stood before a judge in 1983, and that judge said, you will never be able to change. Let me back up, though. I knew Judy Clark before the crime.
Go ahead, talk about sort of your history with history.
I knew her in Brooklyn, where she was a member of the group May 19th Communist Organization, they called themselves, and she was close to close friends of mine. And
this is the 1970s?
The 1970s, and I knew Judy to be both a happy, bubbly person who was nice to hang out with, as well as someone who was absolutely rigid and fierce and with whom you could not have a simple conversation or debate. And I found that to be always disquieting about dealing with her. But then the crime happened, 1981, and I didn't see or have anything to do with Judy for 25 years.
What was your reaction? I mean, if you can put yourself back and remember when you learned of it, what was your reaction, particularly having known her?
I was stunned and appalled that someone I knew could participate in something that was so heedless of human life, that whatever they believed in, that they would do something that would cause people to be killed, whatever the political cause was. I was disgusted, furious, and wanted nothing to do with her.
And you had nothing to do with her, I guess, until what, 2006 or so?
Mutual friends who had visited her over the years, who I would talk to, would say, Judy's really gone through some very heavy changes, and you should really go up and just get to know her again. And I refused for a long time. I just thought, I'm just not interested in reacquainting myself with someone who let me down so badly. Mm-hmm. But eventually enough people of goodwill told me this. I thought, let me go up and see her. And I was skeptical after the first couple of visits. I went a number of times, But eventually, I became convinced that this was someone who had really changed. She was much more thoughtful. She was, to me, truly remorseful for what had happened. And she said things that were very different from anything that I had ever heard from people who were from her political background, including some of her famous former associates,
Right.
like Bernardine Dorn and Bill Ayers, all of whom who had written stories or memoirs sort of celebrating their past.
Absolutely.
Judy said none of that. Judy was absolutely angry and furious with herself for having participated in the act. And she was probably the fiercest critic of herself. And I thought that was interesting. So I kept going to see her.
And you saw this as almost a conversion that was real?
You know, we never know people absolutely.
Right.
But I believe that Judy Clark has made herself into one of the most self-critical, reflective, and thoughtful people I know.
Okay.
So
why then the Times piece? What were the circumstances that led to the writing of the piece and the publication of the piece?
well, I'm a reporter, and I thought it was a great story.
And obviously the Times did. They put it on the cover. You've said elsewhere that you believe the story would be both compelling and instructive on many levels. What are the lessons? What should we be instructed about by looking at her life and reflecting on it?
I think you ticked off some of them in your intro there. You know, I mean, look, this is someone who did participate in a terrible crime that had terrible, terrible repercussions for not just the victims who died, but for their families. Children, there were 9 children who were left fatherless because of the 3 deaths that resulted from that robbery.
And wives without husbands and mothers without sons and friends without friends.
Yeah, all of that, all of those unthinkable losses. So then you get to the question of, well, what is the right punishment for that? And is there a rule at which we can apply that sort of measures whether or not someone has changed and therefore they merit release? In Judy Clark's case, she compounded her crime by acting, I think, insanely at her trial.
Talk about that. It was really one of those things that you had to go back to the record and almost live through. Describe sort of her behavior as a defendant in this case.
She basically boycotted the case. She refused to be represented by counsel. She and her 2 co-defendants sat out most of the trial in a basement holding cell, listening to the testimony against them being piped in. The times that they did appear in court, they said horrific, terrible things, justifying revolutionary violence. Quote,
Right,
unquote.
right. And almost sealing their doom in some ways. I mean, she was the driver. She wasn't the person who actually pulled the triggers on the murders, but in many ways, she was the most rhetorically inflaming of all the defendants. And in a sense, it almost seems that she got 75 years, not for the crime, but for the antics.
I think that's exactly true. I think it's exactly true. I think that she basically ended up with a sentence of 75 years to life because of the fact that she refused to show any remorse or even any culpability for this terrible crime.
And now, at least in your experience, you see that this is you call this person a different person.
Yeah, I think she is a different person.
Okay, now, the fact that she's a different person, does that mean, again, let's go back to this metric. How do we measure the appropriate punishment, or how do we determine what justice is in this case?
Well,
go ahead.
One of the things to remember is that justice is fickle. We measure different cases by different yardsticks depending on what the punishment is allowed to us. One of the things that was most striking to me when I was reading some of the responses to my story in the Times in the weeks afterwards was that 2 weeks later, in the same place in Orange County in Goshen, where Judy Clark was sentenced to 75 years to life, there were stories about this fellow who had taken a young woman from a nightclub in Chelsea up to his home in Orange County, where he had smothered her, and when he realized she was dead, threw her in the back of the trunk of his car, drove her into the woods in Pennsylvania, disposed of the body, and then lied about it for the next 3 years while her parents and her family agonized, not knowing what had happened to her. This fellow, standing in that same courtroom, pled guilty to a manslaughter charge and was given a sentence of 19 years.
Well, clearly, the notion of justice is a very difficult
Justice
one.
is fickle. In other words, here's a guy who, in terms of culpability, as to how do we measure like human venality and human evil, what he confessed to doing, and he put all this openly in court, he allocuted to what he had done, was much worse, certainly, than Judy Clark being a getaway driver at a political crime. What happened at Judy's crime was worse in terms of the number of lives lost, but in terms of the evil perpetrated by somebody. So he's only going to do 19 years, which is less than a third of what Judy Clark's sentence is.
Yeah.
Also, one of Judy's co-defendants was much better known than her, a woman named Kathy Boudin.
Absolutely.
Kathy Boudin had been a fugitive from a famous explosion that had happened at a townhouse in Greenwich Village
Right,
back
on
in
11th,
1970, right? And she had been underground, part of this loose affiliation of these weather underground radicals all these years. And she surfaced and she was caught at the site. And one of the things that happened when she was waiting trial was that she was represented by her father, who was a very well-known attorney, by two other very well-known attorneys. And she agreed to plead guilty. And because she pled guilty, the judge gave her a sentence of 20 to life and said that I think that once you serve that sentence, you should be eligible for parole. Fast forward, Judy and Catherine Boudin served their time together at Bedford Hills, but in 2003, Catherine Boudin finally came up for parole, and after 2 tries, she was finally granted parole, much to the chagrin of the governor Pataki at the time.
Sure.
But she was released. So, again, like, justice is fickle. How do you measure these two things? One gets 75 for being a getaway driver, the other gets 20 years and serves 22.
Okay. I mean, you talk about responses. The piece really stimulated response. If you look at the blogs and you look what's written, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of blog postings, not only at the Times, which they seem to have cut them off after 533, but all over the internet, from right-wingers to extreme left-wingers. And there's a cacophony out there. There's no real agreement. Now, you must have received dozens, if not scores, if not hundreds of emails. What was the reaction?
Well, you know, one of the things that was interesting about it, you say, is that like it resonated with people because of the politics, I think, number one. It wasn't just an isolated crime. It was a crime associated with politics. So it rang the bell for people both on the left and the right. And I heard from people on the left who said, I can still never forgive these people for what they did to left-wing movements because their absurd, nihilist attempt destroyed part of the movement.
Yep.
And there's a lot of people who still believe that and are not ready to forgive her. Much more so on the right. She represents to people this Bernardine Dohrn, Bill Ayers, this whole sort of mindset, which like is still out there someplace. And I think this became, well, we're not going to let those people off the hook. We're still mad at them. What they did was terrible things. But you know, what's really interesting was that one of the things that Judy Clark did that helped convince me that she truly had been radically transformed was that as early as the early 1990s, she declared, when she was described in a little publication as a political prisoner, she said, I'm not a political prisoner. She said, I can only think of what I did with shame, remorse, and guilt. And she has stuck to that ever since. In fact, she tells me that she gets letters sometimes from students, well-meaning students, who are saying, I'm writing to you as a political prisoner. And she writes back and she says, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I don't consider myself a political prisoner.
She's a criminal.
Her crime was motivated by politics, but it was a crime, and she accepts that.
Yep.
But I was just going to make the point was that some of the anger on the right, they still see her through a political prism. In other words, they still see her, even though she denies that she's a political prisoner, doesn't want to be one, and doesn't consider herself one. To them, part of the purpose of keeping her in is because she is political, and therefore she must pay the penalty.
One of the blogs, I just pulled out tons of blogs because there was very thoughtful commentary. One of the blog postings said, Ms. Clark is rehabilitated, but this does not mean she deserves a break. So you can be, and in this person's view, yeah, he believes that in a sense she's been rehabilitated, but in a sense, does she deserve the break in the sort of grand accounting of what justice is? I mean, the bottom line is this is about what justice is, and how do you, go ahead.
Let me say two things. I mean, one is I tried really hard in this story to come as close as I could to walk in the shoes of the victims and their families.
And it's obvious in here.
I reached out to all of them that I could. I attended a breakfast that was held for a scholarship fund in the name of the 2 officers who were killed in Nyack. I talked at great length to the nephew of one of the officers who was killed, Ed O'Grady. His nephew, John Hanchar, agreed to talk to me. And I was very struck by some of the things that John said in particular, because he said, you know, the thing that bothers me, Tom, is that places like the Times and other publications keep coming back to what happened to these prisoners, but they don't focus on my uncle, what happened. And I thought that was a very legitimate complaint that he had. And I tried to be able to answer that in the story by simply describing his uncle as a human being, about how proud his uncle would have been to have seen one of his sons graduate from Annapolis, about Waverly Brown, who was the only black officer in Nyack. You talk about ironies. He was one of the guys who was killed at the roadblock when the robbers were stopped. He was apparently an inspiration and a help to local kids. It's like a lifesaver for the one guy that I interviewed. So I really wanted to be able to see it through their eyes and what would they want to happen. And obviously, I think you can never know, like nothing will ever replace a loved one in your eyes.
No.
So the people who took your loved ones away should pay and pay.
Right.
And yet we have a society in which we're smart enough to say these aren't the people who determine punishment. You know, we try to determine punishment by a different yardstick.
But an arbitrary set of yardsticks, as you pointed out earlier, which bears oftentimes no relationship to the events that transpired.
Well, you know, Judy served 30 years at this point. It's a longer sentence than most murderers serve. Most people who actually
pulled the trigger
or stabbed people to death or did some horrendous things. You know, it's ironic. You know, son of Sam, David Berkowitz, comes up for parole repeatedly. He stopped putting his name forward.
Right.
But because of his sentence, he's been eligible for parole. Judy Clark's not eligible for parole until the year 2056.
She's dead.
Because she got 75.
Should be up, what, 100?
107 years.
You're right. I mean, in one sense, the article is a Rorschach test, that you read the article and you bring with it, the reader brings with it all kinds of conceptions about crime, punishment, justice, etc. You in the piece don't directly argue for her release from prison, but it seems to me, and you comment on it, that it is the right thing to do because in a sense she is a different person than she was 30 years ago, or 28, whatever the number is.
At the end of the day, I don't know what public benefit is served by keeping Judy Clark in prison at this point. I believe that she's proven through her actions in prison that she can be a real plus to society. But also, I believe that the cost to the taxpayers to continue to shoulder, you know, one of the ironic things about Judy is she's still under the description of a potential threat whenever she has to go to a doctor outside the prison, which occasionally they have to do. Recently they had to take her down to Fishkill, which is a nearby men's prison, to see a doctor there. And every time that happens, 5 members of a special Department of Corrections SWAT team come, heavily armed, to be able to escort her there.
Yeah, and in
What's
fact,
the cost?
Right, and in fact, when the various trials took place, it was like total lockdown.
Right, and not, I would argue that made sense at that time. But I would argue now, in 2012, we're just suckers. You know, we're paying an enormous amount of money for that kind of security, which isn't merited. So at the end of it, who's getting screwed here? I think the taxpayers are the ones that are getting screwed.
But I think the issue goes well beyond money, and yes, that may be the case, but that wouldn't be the determining variable on either side of the argument.
No,
really.
but it is one of those considering factors.
Right.
You know, one of the guys I interviewed who didn't make it into the story was a wonderful guy named Mike Higgenson, who's a former NYPD police commander, and he met Judy through a family friend, this wonderful woman who's a nun named Sister Elaine Relate. Sister Elaine introduced him to Judy, and he had visited her a couple of times. And Higginson told me that, you know, if I'd been on the job that day when this happened, I probably would have shot her, and she would have deserved it. But now, I don't see what the plus is for keeping her in. He says, my friends aren't going to like that if you put that in the article.
Right.
But he says, that's the way I feel. I don't see where the public benefits. And I think that people of honest goodwill can look at this and see it from both ways.
Right.
I don't dispute the honesty and integrity of anybody who opposes it.
Right.
But I also think that, like, it's worth the debate.
Yeah, I mean, and it clearly has stimulated that debate. Talking about practical consequences of the piece and its impact, you report in the story that in, I guess it was 2008, David Patterson, who was then the governor of the state of New York, received hundreds of letters of support for clemency, including the former warden at New Bedford Hills, all kinds of various and sundry folks. But Patterson said, and it was quoted in a Jim Dwyer piece, "This is still very raw in Rockland County. There's a memorial, and if I do this, grant clemency, I will get tarred and feathered." Was Patterson right then, and to a certain extent, is he right now?
I think he's right that it's a raw wound still. I mean, I went to the memorial service last fall.
And it's always
on the date.
I mean, it's really
It
a
is.
goosebump-inducing event.
It is a very, very moving
Ooh.
event attended by hundreds of people and officers from all over Westchester and Rockland and Orange County who come, and and as many family members as can be there. And there is a wonderful memorial right there at the intersection of Route 59 and the ramp to the thruway with a lovely stone
Yep.
and a flag,
Yep.
and it's maintained by the local PBA, and it really, everything appropriate that's been done to try to keep the names alive of these officers who died there defending NIAC
Sure.
has been done. And so it is a raw wound, and it'll stay that. But at the same time, I think it's like time for a little truth and reconciliation to try to talk about, at least I would like people to be able to meet and hear Judy Clark, if that's possible.
I mean, what are the odds of, for example, Judy Clark meeting? I presume there's never been a meeting
No.
between Clark and the various individuals who were directly.
And they're probably not interested in meeting with her. But it's one of
Was
those.
that your sense in talking with them?
Yeah, I don't think that this is something which they're interested in reopening. I mean, as one of them said, this is not something we think about every day in
Right.
terms of them in prison. I mean, I ask people like, well, how do you feel about the fact that Kathy Boudin has been out for now almost 10 years? And they said, we don't think about it that much. And I'm thinking, well, that's interesting. Here it is that somebody whose culpability in the crime was on the same par, or perhaps even more so than
right.
Judy's because of her particular role, and it's something they're not thinking of. And the guy who is basically the ringleader and who organized
Right.
the entire thing is in a federal prison, and under federal rules, he was sentenced to 60 years, 15 years less than Judy Clark, but he's eligible for release in 2016, and many people think that's when he's getting out. So that's 50 years before Judy's eligible for release.
Okay.
And that's kind of stunning.
Now, Andrew Cuomo's the governor. There was movement before to have, an executive clemency. Clearly, with this article, that's going to stimulate even more. Is there any possibility? I mean, you almost have to look into the mind of the governor, which is a difficult thing.
Well, now you and I put on different hats.
That's right.
It's like political.
Right. We're moving. We're
critics
moving.
And we,
right. Okay. We're
look,
moving.
Andrew Cuomo obviously is a guy with political ambition. He is enjoying incredibly high numbers as governor. He's not looking for anything to set off some other alarm on another side that he's going to have to take flack for. But I would just say something else. I think that both with Andrew Cuomo, as was with his father Mario, I think there's an inner core of somebody who wants to hear, at least wants to hear about what's the right thing to do.
Ooh, interesting.
And I think, and I believe that we owe him that respect to be able to say, politically, this may be an impossible thing for you to do.
Right.
But we owe it to you to say, this is why we think you should consider it. And then we also owe it to him to step forward and give him that political support if he does it.
Wow.
Because I think that this is something which resonates with people. I mean, one of the things that I was most struck with was the response from some people who are more or less on the right, who wrote and said, I believe, I'm convinced that leniency is the better thing.
Yeah, I mean, Ron Radish, a couple of
very thoughtful piece by Ron Radish.
Right, and
Phyllis
others as
Chesler.
well. Right, really.
And the most thoughtful letter of all that I got was from a fellow who said that he remembered that day like it was yesterday.
Oof.
He was a guy who'd worked at IBM, and he said it was kind of our 9/11 up here. And he said, I thought when I began your article that I feel exactly as I've always felt, that they should just breathe their last breath in prison. But having finished your article, I agree.
Wow.
This woman deserves release.
What kind of feeling do you get from that?
Hope. And
as a reporter, though?
Well, as a reporter, I'm fascinated because of the fact that you can write a story that can stimulate those kind of responses by people all across the board. So I'm very glad to have done it and to have had the opportunity to be able to get the story out there.
Okay. We got to move to, in the last couple of minutes, to current events.
Sure.
The NYPD. Stop and frisk, 684,000. Surveillance of Muslims throughout the Northeast on college campuses and attending rafting trips with them, and then quotas and the cooking of crime numbers. What's going on?
I think to a certain level, we're just finding out stuff that's been sitting out there for almost 10 years that we're just getting some of the specifics on. The Associated Press, who has written these stories about the surveillance, has been the recipient of remarkable insider documents. No one's challenged the accuracy, as far as I know, of what they report.
Right.
In other words, all this stuff happened. Commissioner Ray Kelly and Deputy Commissioner Paul Brown are not saying we didn't do it. They're saying,
unlike the anti-Muslim film that they did, where they prevaricated, if you will.
I think that's a fair word. But in this case, they're saying not only did we did it because we're trying to keep New Yorkers alive. We're trying to protect them. And I think that's a debate which we're going to have here. I mean, look.
This is another important, I mean, that's another really important question.
1993, when the first attack on the World Trade Center happened, this is a point that Ray Kelly makes, you know, I was shocked to read about Sheikh Rahman and the fact that I live in Brooklyn, and here this guy was a few blocks away from me preaching the kind of hate and urging people to go out and do things like blow up the World Trade Center. I said, well, how come we didn't know about that? Why didn't someone tell us? And it turned out that there was some sort of vague surveillance on him. They did have some knowledge on him, and there had been some effort at one point to deport him, but it had never really been acted on. So on one hand, you really want the NYPD to tell us about Sheikh Rahmans who are out there. And on the other hand, you don't want them going to just well-meaning kids in college groups that are coming together, identifying themselves as Muslims, the same way Jewish students identify themselves as Jews, and spying on them because of that. I mean, that offends, I think, every basic sort of civil liberties instinct that Americans have.
So we're in another conundrum. We're full of these conundrums.
I think that you have to get to the threshold. I think that the threshold becomes when you spot things that are wrong, when you spot bad actors, when you hear people saying things that are wrong, when someone brings something to your service, this guy really is a bad apple, let's keep an eye on him. But if you're just looking, if your only yardstick is to say, oh, it's a Muslim association, MSAs, as Paul Brown calls it. Oh, every Muslim student association, we have to go and track them. I think that's a pretty dangerous road to go down.
Okay, let's talk about that road and go down that road in a couple of months to follow up both on this story and on the NYPD, the Judith Clark story and the NYPD story.
Right.
It's always a pleasure talking
so
with you, and I love the fact that you're a colleague at the journalism
Me
school.
too.
My thanks to Tom Robbins for being on the show. Join me next week when my guest will be David Jones, President and CEO of the Community Service Society of New York, here on CUNY TV. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.